Let me turn briefly to another area of the country, the so-called New South, the South after Reconstruction, because it has contributed to our society, our culture, and our politics in extraordinary ways. It also served as a supply source for Northern industrialization. However, the New South was born out of racism. The motto, "This is white man's country, let white men rule." That was what united Southerners to take back the South as they saw it from federal control and once again establish white rule in the South. You will recall that the Civil War pretty much destroyed the Old South, its cities, its people, and its infrastructure. Northern troops had destroyed most of the railroads in the South and many of the roads and bridges. All of that had to be rebuilt. It is estimated that as many as a third of Southern men were either killed or crippled in the war. In fact, in the Reconstruction era, the number one industry in Mississippi was making artificial limbs. You may recall the stories of the carpetbaggers, those Northerners who came south after the war to, as Southerners saw it, exploit the poor, downtrodden South. And they were often met with violence as the South struggled to try to free itself from what it saw as control by the federal government. One of the most horrific ways that this was done was by threatening African Americans. Lynching was developed primarily after the Civil War, and it was not just a means of execution, but it was a signal to Southern blacks to stay in their place. And you have horrific examples. It was not just hanging. For example, this picture shows a black man who was not just hanged, but also burned alive, while the white people stood around and smiled. The New South did have a little bit of industry, mainly industry that had been developed during the war to supply the Southern war effort, like this steel factory in Birmingham. But for the most part, the New South was just like the Old South. Growing cotton was king. Agriculture was the way of life, as was rural life in the South. Many of the former slaves ended up doing the same jobs for the landowners that they had done as slaves. But in the New South, this new labor arrangement became known as sharecropping. Sharecropping was basically slavery by another name. Former slaves and poor whites would be hired to farm land owned by white landowners. They did not get paid a salary. Instead, when the harvest was sold, they would get a share of the crop. That's where you get the term sharecropping. And often their share of the crop when it was sold did not meet the obligations that they had run up, like at the local store, to feed themselves and clothe themselves during the year until the new crop came in. Thus, they became indebted and were forced to continue to work the land, because if they left and ran out on their debts, they would be considered a criminal and arrested. Thus, the new labor system in the South that replaced slavery was sharecropping. And very easily, sharecropping could turn into debt peonage. As this video shows, sharecropping was not a way of life that most people would choose, but it was what was available to many, probably most, of the former slaves. Yes, they were free, but they were still shackled. Because they did not own the land that they farmed, they had no say in how the land was used. And many times they were not even allowed enough space to grow a garden of food for themselves. They would plant cotton right up to their cabin doors. Yes, the cabins, such as they were provided by the landlord. But this forced many of the sharecroppers to depend on the local store, also often owned by the local landlord, for food and clothes during the year as they worked to plant, cultivate, and harvest the crops. And they did this on credit. The store would give them credit. Now, they couldn't comparison shop, like see who had the lowest price on a sack of flour or something like that by checking at Costco or Kroger or whatever. They had to pay whatever the store said was the price. And therefore, very often, by the time they got paid, they had more debt than they could pay off. And therefore, they were obliged to stay and farm another year. So for many former slaves and some poor whites, life in the New South was very much like it had been in the Old South, working the fields of land owned by someone else. And the children were forced to work in the fields along with their families. There was not much time for education because the family became dependent on everybody working to make as big a crop as possible so that they could make enough money to get by. So the new South was not that different than the Old South. The biggest difference was that African Americans were no longer slaves, although they were in many cases treated as if they were still slaves. They were discriminated against. They were segregated. In fact, segregation began in the South and spread throughout the country. Segregation, forcing black people to use separate facilities, you live in different places, separated places. This became a national standard. After the Civil War, For the only time in history, the losers wrote the first histories of the war. And they were determined to put the war into a Southern perspective, that the war was justified because the federal government was too strong, that they just lost not because their cause wasn't right, but because the South had more men and more guns. And so as the Southerners were writing this type of history, there began to grow in the South what has become known as the myth of the lost cause. And that is that the Old South was the proper way to do things, and that the federal government messed up paradise. So the New South continued to celebrate its Confederate roots. It came to the opinion that they had the only proper solution for what to do about all those freed black people. And that was to segregate them, to treat them as second-class citizens, to not allow them to have any say-so or power. This was the New South. And you may have recently seen in the headlines the move to take down these memorial statues to Confederate leaders. For instance, this one in Dallas, featuring statues of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Albert Johnson, celebrating the Confederacy. This monument to Confederate soldiers used to stand on the Tarrant County Courthouse lawn. This view of the romantic Old South, of genteel ladies, gentlemanly men, was reinforced by books and movies, particularly the movie Gone with the Wind, which depicted the South as being overrun by these uncouth Yankees, and then allowing black people to tell white people what to do. So the image of the Old South that began to emerge from this myth telling was one where they were a better culture than that polyglot northern urban immigrant culture. They were mostly white Christians, and therefore they had a better way of life. The myth of the lost cause also depicts black people as being happy as slaves, because the racist mind says that black people are intellectually inferior. They are childlike. They need to be told what to do, and they need to be controlled, just like children. And this became the attitude towards African Americans, not just in the South, but in most of the country in the late 1800s. And thus began the celebration of Southern heritage, as it is called today. Beautiful plantation homes, genteel people. This is a picture of Oak Alley in Louisiana that you can visit on a tour of plantation homes to this day. What it doesn't say is that that house was built by slaves with money earned by slaves for the white landowners. This myth of the lost cause still impacts our lives today. We hear the Sons of the Confederacy saying that they are opposing taking down these monuments because they want to preserve their Southern history, their Southern heritage. They want to honor their forefathers who fought so bravely in the Civil War. And so that has had a big impact, not just on American attitudes, but on attitudes towards race in the United States to this day. It brings up issues. For example, are these celebrations of Southern pride depicted in these pictures? Or is this racism? Because the Confederate battle flag symbolized a war to defend slavery. Now, part of the clause says that the war was not about slavery, that it was about federal power, it was about states' rights. And so they say we're not here to show the stars and bars because of slavery, but because of our Southern heritage. But that brings up the question of whose heritage? The stars and bars certainly don't stand for those former slaves that were freed by the Civil War. The Southern solution to what they saw as the, quote, Negro problem, unquote, after the war was to segregate black people from white people in every way possible, to make sure that black people were not treated as equals. And so that was the Southern solution. And it soon became the national solution to the issue of race in America. Segregation was not simply separation of the races. It was also a strategy to keep African Americans down, to keep them lower class, to keep them subservient to the master white race. And it was criminal law in the South that segregation must be sacrosanct. People were arrested for daring to break over, perhaps to live in the wrong neighborhood, to go into the wrong door of a public establishment, to try to eat in a restaurant where black people were not allowed. These kinds of things led to arrests, convictions, prison time, or even lynchings. Then in 1896, the Supreme Court, in its ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, made segregation the law of the United States, the entire country, when it ruled that segregation was legal, that you could have separate but equal facilities for black and white people. The separate part was strongly enforced. The equal part, nobody paid much attention. And so you can guess who got the better of that deal. Booker T. Washington emerged as the leader of black resistance to segregation. However, he was viewed by some as being too accommodating to white people. He began Tuskegee Institute as a school to teach African Americans how to make a living. Most of the curriculum we would call the trades today, things like carpentry and masonry, bricklaying, stuff like that. He also trained black teachers who would go out into these segregated black schools and try to teach black children to read, write, do math, get an education. In his famous Atlanta address, Booker T. Washington advised black people that the best way to gain equality was through hard work, economic success, high morals, and obeying the law. To some blacks, this was accommodating the whites. To whites, it was a welcome message because it told black people, basically, stay in your place. Now, what it does not say is what Booker T. Washington was doing behind the scenes. This was his public persona. Behind the scenes, he was working in secret to try to end segregation and discrimination. Perhaps Washington's most vociferous critic was the black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. He disagreed with Washington that blacks, by working hard and being economically successful and living moral lives, could earn equality. Du Bois said, no, we don't have to earn equality. We got it with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. What needs to happen is we need to be more active, more aggressive in trying to get those laws enforced so that we get our rights. It's not a matter of earning them, it's a matter of getting them. It was Du Bois who helped to form what was called the Niagara Movement, named for the falls. This was an integrated group of both white and black leaders, and they could not find any hotel in the United States that would allow an integrated group to meet in that hotel. So they went across the border into Canada, Niagara, Canada, to hold the first meeting of an organization that would grow into one of the most prominent and important black organizations in the history of the United States. Because out of the Niagara movement grew the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, that would be a more aggressive pursuer of black rights, particularly through the courts. Beginning in the early 20th century, the NAACP began to use lawyers and the courts to try to win the rights of African Americans.